Okay, Megan, I want to start by asking the group if you can just give me a bit of a heads up on how much they know already about publishing. Are they advanced, intermediate, or newbies?
How about you two? I have two people in the room with me here. What about you?
I want to say intermediate.
Intermediate and?
Yeah, I would say intermediate as well.
Intermediate.
Okay. And the others would probably be the same?
I think so. I've got another intermediate from Mo in Calgary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. Let's get going then. I've got a lot of material today, so stop me if I'm going too quickly, or let me know if I'm going too slowly too. I've brought some things that I found interesting today, so let's get going. So basically, this is what I want to do today. I want to talk about why publications are so important, and I want to talk about some of the challenges that you're going to face going forward. And I'm going to show you some examples, because I think in this case, examples are really crucial for learning. And I'm going to break every pedagogical rule. The theory is that you should never show students bad examples. You should teach with positive examples. But I'm going to show you bad examples just to show you what kind of trouble that some people have gotten into. I'm sure you've run into some issues too, so when we get to the appropriate section, if you want to talk about some of your experiences, both good and bad, do jump in. So let's get going. So talking about publish or perish, well, here's a fellow who almost perished. This man in the picture was actually fired for putting pressure on his graduate students and postdocs to publish more and publish inappropriately, and he was fired from his job, and he was so unhappy that he actually shot the dean. So yeah, I guess publish or perish yeah, there's certainly something to that expression. So I want to talk a little bit about why publication is so important for me. I was a faculty member for a good number of years, and almost everything in my job depended on the quality of my publications, the quantity of my publications, and yeah, these are the things that publications affect when you're a researcher or a faculty member. And I've highlighted the ones that are probably most important. Yeah, my raises, my promotion, my tenure, my job, my grant getting. Also, if I had lots of publications, I got a better office and I got better equipment. I could recruit my students a little bit better. I got better students, and of course, my reputation depended on basically on my publishing. They say education is important, but in the grand scheme of things, it's publications that are probably more important for faculty people. And here's why publication is important for you. You probably already know this, but your job, either your current or your future job, including your postdocs, are going to be affected by how many and the quantity of your publications. And your reputation, both within the institution and outside. If you want to recruit undergraduate students to help you with your work, it helps if you have publications. And to me, publications I always saw them as sort of building blocks of your career or my career. And yeah, I think the thing too about publication is that it can set up a research domain that's yours. This is my domain. I'm publishing in it. You're welcome to come and join me, but it's my work. So important for graduate students for sure. And publications are also important for institutions. Institutions are graded in many ways by the number of publications, the number of high-quality publications, the number of citations. And an institution, I know University of Toronto has a really good reputation on publishing. The McMaster folks have a pretty good reputation. I think we have fewer publications, but I think we have more publications for faculty members when you're comparing the two medical schools. and certainly leverage in getting big grants and government support. The governments like to support research-intensive institutions, and the best way to measure, or certainly the most used method of measuring the worth of a university, is how they publish. And I also think institutions want happy alumni. They like to see their institutions in the news, certainly in good light. So now I want to talk about the content. There's a whole bunch of issues around the content when you do publications. You probably already know this, but I just kind of want to show you some of the issues and some of the issues that people have gotten themselves into trouble with. The first thing with content is, do you have enough content to publish? And here we're talking, the terms that quite often come up are salami slicing and least publishable unit. So what's the least publishable unit in your dissertation or your thesis? So think about that. What is the least publishable unit? What's the most sensible sort of publishable unit? If I'm doing a big grant, how finely do I slice it? Sort of talking about salami slicing, it can be pretty thin. And I've seen some studies that have multiple publications, and you kind of wonder, why do they have so many publications? It would have been almost nicer from a review if they put a couple of them together. So think carefully about about your least publishable unit. And I'm also going to talk about data, and I'm going to talk about figures and images, and I'm going to talk about plagiarism. And the three that I've got bolded are called the unholy trinity by journal editors. They're the ones that they bump into the most: falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. So we're going to talk about each one of those. And actually, I already talked about salami slicing or least publishable units. And I've seen papers that, most often they cover too little information, but I've also seen papers that cover too much material. So think carefully about, do you have enough to publish? Do you have enough to publish more than one paper? And on this one, I think you should get some advice from your supervisor or your mentor. Is this enough to publish, or do I need to do a little bit more? And remember that your paper needs to be seen as important and strong if it's going to build your career and be read. If I were in person with you, I would ask you, what's the median number of citations per journal in the healthcare world? And actually, the median number of citations that each paper has, it's actually 0. There's a lot of papers out there that are never read. And seriously about what's the content. Do you have enough to publish? Do you have too much to publish one paper? Okay, let's move on to falsification. So falsification is where you change your existing data and you want to make them bigger, you want to make them better, you want to get rid of stuff that doesn't support your initial hypothesis. You want to make them more important, more dramatic, and of course, more significant. Bigger p-values, tighter confidence intervals. So falsification is where you have existing data and then you do something to them that, you do something to them to make them look better or more important. And here's an example. This is from the University of Florida. I pulled out a lot of these examples from Retraction Watch. I mean, it's a fascinating site that you can learn an awful lot from. So anyway, this Florida researcher, he was medical engineering, so not quite healthcare, but pretty close to healthcare. So he was a faculty member and a postdoc and scientist, and turned out that he very selectively chose the data that he was going to put in his paper, and then the silly fellow, he actually sent an email to the whistleblower describing what he had done. So you cannot selectively choose your information, although I'm sure you don't do that, but lots of people have in the past, and they've got themselves into really serious trouble. So let's move on to fabrication. Fabrication is where you completely make up the data. It's not falsification. It's not data that you have. It's completely making up the data. And I'm always astonished at how much of this goes on, certainly in some of the, not in necessarily in the major journals, but a lot of the other journals. Some countries put an incredible amount of pressure on people to their faculty members to publish, and yeah, I'm not going to name countries, but some countries are, yeah, they're almost, I feel bad for the researchers because they're yeah, they just have such pressure on them to publish, and they don't have a lot of resources for equipment or graduate students, so the push to publish is quite something. I could have brought many papers to show you, but the worst example that I've ever seen is one that was published actually quite a few years ago, but it was on oral cancer and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. So oral cancer is pretty important, and lots of people taking NSAIDs. And this paper, I have never seen such beautiful survival curves, and I'm going to show you one in a minute. So from PubMed, and I spelled from wrong, here's the citation to PubMed. So PubMed, they actually tag this article as a retracted article. Not all retracted papers get a heading, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but it's easy to find a paper that's published. It's a lot more difficult to find a paper that's retracted. Journals don't like to advertise the fact that they've had to retract a paper. Authors aren't necessarily proud of the fact that their paper is retracted, and do they necessarily tell the people who put Medline and PubMed together. So this is a fascinating article. The author, a good-looking fellow by the name of Sedbo. There's another Sedbo in his list of authors. Some of the authors in the paper didn't even realize that they were authors on this paper. They, and it was in Lancet, and when the Lancet folks actually were looking at this, they got a hold of all of the authors, and a good number of the authors were absolutely astonished. So it's a fascinating paper, nested case control study, a huge study. They had 454 people with oral cancer, so many men, so many women, age, and they had matched controls, NSAID use, and then looked at the oral cancer and looked back to see for NSAID use. Brilliant paper, very pretty. The only way that people found out that this was fabricated data was the woman who looked after the cohort of Norway, this Connor database. She was spending Christmas holidays from October to December. She was catching up on her reading, and she said, "That's my database. What is going on here? I don't recognize that man." So she got a hold of the Lancet. They went through and realized that this was a completely fabricated paper. Look at the data. I mean, how could you make that up? I mean, that must have taken a heck of a lot of work. It might almost have been easier to actually go to the database, get permission to use it, and then do the study. Here's the survival curves. You know, those of you who are into survival curves, you know, to me this is an absolutely brilliant survival curve. I mean, I'd be proud to have that kind of survival curve listed. And you can see down in the lower corner the big red marks. That's a big stamp that says retracted across 4 of the survival curves. So it's not easy necessarily to find fabricated papers or even falsified papers. So yeah, just think carefully about it. Okay, I want to also talk about inappropriate data analysis. You know, sometimes people make legitimate mistakes, but Retraction Watch claims that a lot of people do inappropriate data analysis on purpose. You know, are you going to use one-sided or two-sided p-values? Are you going to tell the people you're using one-sided p-values? Are you going to tell the people in the paper that you're using 80% confidence intervals instead of 95? There's lots of ways to cheat on analysis methods, and there's also a lot of ways to make mistakes on analysis methods. I've certainly been surprised a few times in realizing that I had done inappropriate analysis. And this is a paper that I found absolutely fascinating. And it's looking at, from Retraction Watch, and it's looking at makeup use is linked to testosterone levels. And basically the authors were saying that a woman's hormone levels drive their desire to be attractive. So if you have higher hormone levels, you're going to use more makeup. Fascinating paper, a little bit offensive but fascinating. And it turned out that these people were they published this paper. There was a lot of interest in this paper. I think Psychology Today wrote up the paper and talked about it. The way they found out that this paper was had some problems was a graduate student in a statistical class took the data. They had put their data in as an additional file, an additional online file. One of the students in the statistics class analyzed the data and said there's a problem with the data, and once you correct the problem, the data falls apart. There is no link between hormone levels and makeup use. So be careful with your statistical methods. Yeah, many people actually have been caught using inappropriate statistical methods when someone else tries to figure out what was going on. There was a man in Newfoundland who actually, I think he lost his job because his data was too good. One of the statistical professor was looking at the data and said, this data is too perfect, cannot be possible. They investigated and the fellow lost his job. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about omission too. Omission is another sin that happens in publishing. And omission is where you leave out certain information or material. You can do it on purpose or you can do it by accident. And one of the big places where you have omission is where sometimes you forget or you don't want to include citations to others' works if those other papers are not consistent with what you set out to try and prove. So there's a lot of people who are very selective on what they do, what they put in their discussion section. Sometimes people leave out things like they ran into problems with their methods. This is what we plan to do, and they don't bother to tell you that they had to maybe recruit fewer patients than they decided. Certainly can leave out data points. You know, I hated outliers some days when I was doing research projects, but you know, you can't leave stuff out. You've got to be really honest and truthful about what's going on. And here's an omission paper that, or an omission issue that I found. So the National Football League and the New York Times got into a bit of a tussle over whether the NFL had left out data on diagnosed concussions from peer-reviewed studies. And I think that they haven't come to a meeting of the minds yet. But the New York Times felt that the NFL had left out numbers of concussions to make the sport look a little bit less dangerous than it is. And I think we're going to be hearing more about that as time goes on. But yeah, lots of stuff happens with omissions, so be careful on omissions. And here's another one that similar sorts of things. That this was looking at a paper on prenatal and postnatal stress, and the authors of this paper basically left out a lot of studies that were didn't necessarily support what they're saying. So, and it's fairly important journal. So be careful when you're reading or when you're writing on what you include in your discussion section. There's been a lot of stuff lately about figures and images. Certainly with a lot of, the blots and all of the genetic stuff, they rely a lot on images. And Photoshop has just, made things a little bit too easy to make your pictures look a little bit more dramatic, to make your black dots look a little bit blacker, to make them a little bit crisper. And in some places, people have used the same images over and over again in subsequent papers, and that's gotten them into trouble. And it's been a real headache for journal editors, and there's been a whole industry around looking for image modifying detectors. There are a lot of good programs out there now that will be able to tell you if an image has been modified or not. And of course that goes back and forth. The more the journal editors find these image modifying detectors, people are trying to make better and better. The history of actually manipulation of image goes back to the U.S. Civil War. Time magazine published an incredibly interesting series of photos that were modified. I can send you that link if you want, but there's been a big history of manipulation of images going back to make one's work a little bit more impressive than they really were. So what did I bring here? Yes, this fellow. Here's a paper from Journal of Immunology. I think it's not a bad journal, but it came from the University of Colorado, Denver, and this professor is a former professor, altered dozens and dozens of images, and he lost many papers. So it goes on, and it's really hard for both reviewers and journal editors. It makes journal reviewers' jobs a little bit harder for sure. Now I want to talk about plagiarism. I have talked about plagiarism, I think, in every class I ever took or ever gave, and learn how to avoid it. It is really, really easy to fall into plagiarism. I used to tell my students that cut and paste was a two-edged sword, so be very careful with it. There's actually some software out there that actually will take, and this is driving faculty members and journal editors batty, but there's software out there that will take a chunk of text that you want to deplagiarize, and it will change the words around for you so that you'll be able to avoid that. But that's not a good fix. Don't do that. You also, so I'm not going to spend any more time looking at plagiarism of other people's works, but I want to talk a little bit about something that's just as dangerous. It's when you plagiarize from your own work. I'm going to pick on Newfoundland again. There's a case now where a professor is going up for tenure, and he didn't bother to tell the publishers involved that he had put a book chapter in that was exactly the same as a paper he'd written. So that's not necessarily a bad thing to move the book chapter, the journal article, to a book chapter, but you have to tell the people that you've actually done that. So he may be in danger of not getting tenure just because he didn't say, oh, by the way, this article was from. Some people call self-plagiarism duplication, and even if you've not signed your copyright over to a journal, you really do need to be vigilant about plagiarism of your own work. And here, the next article that I brought is this is a serial plagiarism. This fellow has lost 14 papers because of plagiarism. You would think he would learn, but he obviously hasn't. And be careful with plagiarism no matter where it's from, because it can come back to bite you. And here's a hint that we used back at McMaster. We did a mammoth study many years ago where we looked at search filters. We had search filters for therapy, diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, quality of care, economics, cost studies. I think that was about it, review articles, and we looked at finding articles from Medline, MBASE, which is the European Medline Accumulated Index to Nursing and Allied Health, and PsycInfo. So we had 40 plus papers from this study, and of course each paper needs its own methods section, and we were worried that, you know, how do you write up the methods description across 40 plus papers without plagiarizing. So what we did at the very first part of this study is we published a protocol paper with the methods very well described. And then when it came time to writing up these 40 plus papers, we were able to say, as per the methods, and you know, for this filter, looking at economic studies, say in PsycInfo, we had to make these modifications for these reasons. And it saved us a lot of energy, and it also saved us from charges of self-plagiarism. So think about that. If you're going to have multiple papers from one study, seriously consider doing a protocol paper at the start so that you don't have to repeat a lot of the methods. Citations. This is something that I've been thinking about for a while, but I hadn't realized there was a term for it. This is called citation stacking. And this is where you can get yourself into troubles too. So authors will, I certainly had to, when I was writing my, doing my CV up for my promotion and tenure in my annual reviews, we had to include the number of citations that each paper had, and that's a fair bit of work. But some authors will actually keep citing their own papers to inflate their citation scores. So be careful with that. You can certainly cite your own work if it's important and you're doing a series of papers, but do remember that, yeah, don't be tempted too much to include all 50 of your citations. Editors are actually pushing you to add citations to papers from their journals. Journals are also ranked on how many citations per article they have. That's their impact factor, their journal impact factor. And actually Sharon Strauss actually said that she has bumped into an issue where the journal editor will come back and say, guess what, here's 2 papers from our journal that you could reasonably cite in your article. Yeah, we suggest you include these 2 papers once we accept your paper. So that's journals. So authors will try to inflate their citation scores. Editors will sometimes try to inflate their citation scores. I've seen departments that push for citations. You need to, yeah, whatever you do, make sure you include citations to other members in the department in your papers. And there was actually a university, I think, in Asia that pushed all of their researchers. They sent a memo to all of the researchers in the university saying it is now policy to cite 3 other authors, 3 other researchers from our faculty or our university in your study. So that's called citation stacking. So just be careful on that. You certainly wouldn't lose your job for citation stacking, but yeah, just something to think about in academic integrity issues. Okay, now we're going to leave content, and I just wonder if any of you have any questions on anything I've put out, or any comments on content any publishing that you've done.
Nothing from the room here with me. No from Ruth. And I don't see anything at the moment, but I'll let you know if something comes in.
Okay, sounds good. Am I going too fast or too slow, or covering stuff you've already know, or what's the any feedback on?
I'm getting thumbs up from here.
Okay, we'll keep going. I have some other incredible papers to show you. But yeah, don't turn me into the pedagogical police. I should be showing you good examples, not bad, but the bad ones are more fun. Oh, okay, so let's move to authorship. Now, authorship has caused more grief in publishing, I think, for individuals than any other issue. And I think graduate students are incredibly vulnerable to be taken advantage of here. You know, I got more points towards my salary increase score by making sure that either I was the first author or my graduate students were first authors. Yeah, there's just an awful lot of pressure out in the world to sort of push to the front of the line. You get more benefit if you push to the front of the line, except it's push to the front of the publisher list. And there's a couple of ways around it. I've seen one research group that says we'll do all of the authors and we're going to do them in alphabetical order. The first paper we'll do in alphabetical order starting with A, and the next paper we'll do starting with Z. So they do it by alphabetical order. Doesn't always solve problems. In some domains, certainly in chemistry, some of the hard sciences, the brains of the paper are usually last. In health sciences, you don't get a lot of points for being last. So I brought these authorship issues. I'm just going to talk about each of them in order. So guest authorship. This is where you make your paper a little bit more publisher, because I've got really important people. Like if I wanted to get my KT paper published, I would push to make sure that Sharon Strauss was on my list, or Ian Graham of authors. So that's guest authorship. That's where you choose people to put them on just for their name, not for their contribution. A gift authorship is where it's kind of an expected authorship. For example, the principal investigator may push to have his or her name on every paper that's published from a big grant. Certainly lab heads, the heads of labs quite often will say, any paper that goes out of my lab needs to have my name on it. Certainly years ago, the department chairs, certainly in some of the sciences that I worked in, would say that every paper out of my department will have my name on it. So that's kind of tightening up, but it's out there. So guest and gift and ghost authorship. Ghost authorship is an issue quite often with pharmacy-funded, industry-funded papers. They won't necessarily, they'll say, I'm the pharmacy rep for this drug, let me help you write the paper. I've got a really good medical writer that will help you. You have people with, say, a history of working for tobacco or working for the asbestos industry that will provide funding and help you write your paper up, but they don't want to be included in the list of authors. So watch out for ghost authorship. You can also have anonymous authorships. Once in a while, I'm not sure any research that I've done, it's maybe dangerous to list your author. Sometimes reports will go to anonymous authors. That doesn't happen very often, but I included it anyway. Group authorship, sometimes you will see studies that are, you've seen the studies that are named all sorts of things, Gissy and Gusto and Vidos, and just, yeah, the list goes on. So Medline will, and editors will include group authorship, but quite often it's frowned upon. Doesn't look good necessarily on one CV to say that, you know, I was one of 54 authors in this study. if you're deceased or incapacitated during the production of an article, you're allowed to put those people on. I've seen multiple papers that will say, you know, so-and-so was an author, he or she contributed this to the paper, but sadly they died before blah, blah, blah. So that's also allowed, deceased or incapacitated. So there's many different types of authorship that you may or may not run into as you go along. Author order. I talked about this before. It's a huge headache. One of our best loved mentors back at McMaster by the name of Charlie Goldsmith. I think Sharon spent some time working with Charlie too. He's just a delightful man, and he has seen just an incredible number of, shall we say, sticky situations. And his theory is that anytime you get a grant, one of the very first meetings of making this grant into reality is that you sit down and say, it looks like we're going to get these 6 papers out of it. There's potential for these 6 papers or 8 papers or whatever, 2 papers. Who wants to work on which paper? Who wants to take the lead of this paper? What do you want to do in relation to this paper? And sort out the order, sort out who's going to do what, and start working on the authorship order early. So yeah, and you're perfectly within your realm of responsibility to be able to say, I'd love to help you with this paper. Can we talk about authorship, and can we talk about authorship order? And this is probably where graduate students have been abused in the publishing world more than any other area. And the abuse might be conscious. It also might be unconscious. So yes, you have the right to ask about this, but do it early in the process. And this is from the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors. They do a fair bit of really good work, and they've come out with these 4 issues. It used to be 3. They've moved to 4 issues, and they say these are the obligations of authorship. And you, as a graduate student, can use this list. It's recognized out there. So you need to be able to say yes to all 4 of those things. And the first one is an or. So you can make substantial contribution, and you have to define that, to the conception or design of the work. So you can design it, or you can do the acquisition, analysis, and interpretation of the data. So do one of 1A or 1B. You have to have a hand in drafting the work and revising it critically. It's got to be more than just a copy editing. You have to approve. You have to have seen and approve of the final version before it's submitted and resubmitted with changes from the reviewers. You also have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work and able to address issues related to accuracy or integrity. So that last one has been added in the last couple of years. So I'm not going to spend any more time on obligations of authorship, but yeah, it's something that you need to very seriously consider when you go out. Another thing that you're going to bump into a little bit further on in your career are peer reviews. Are you going to review articles? The rule of thumb for this, certainly what we talk about at McMaster, is that if you publish 5 papers a year, then you should be reviewing about 5 papers per year. Reviewing papers, it's crucial and it's time consuming to do a really good job. You can learn a lot though. The only thing is you have to be careful that you don't scoop somebody else's ideas, because you're seeing their work before it's out and published. There are problems with peer reviews. No one wants to do them. They take a lot of time. I've already said that. Sometimes authors get into trouble because they suggest their friends. I know that Joe down the lab, down the hall would, he'll say good things about my papers. There's actually a few cases where the authors will provide links back to self so that they will then write the reviews. The author will say, this reviewer is an expert in marine biology health, and here is his email. He would be just a wonderful fellow to write the review for the paper. So the journal said, oh, that sounds like really good. So they send it off, but this person is not real. The review request comes back to the original author because he manipulated a Gmail account, and the author will rewrite his or her own comments to the article, of course, saying good things about it. One fellow who did that, he got caught, but only after the journal editor said, this is bizarre. I've gotten 2 reviews back for this paper, and I just sent it out 2 days ago. There's something fishy going on here. They looked up who the author had suggested and found out that, lo and behold, this person didn't exist. There are ethical guidelines for reviewers, and I'm going to show you them in the next screen. It's the Council of, I forgot what the P stands for, editors. Anyway, there you go, senior moment. But I'll show you the ethical guidelines for reviewers so you don't get yourself into trouble. We're moving away from blinded reviews. So I think in the future we're going to have to be even more careful. I've seen some reviews, blinded reviews, who just say some scathing things and they can get away with it because they're blinded. Okay, here are the basic principles from the COPE folks. You should only agree to review a paper if you know something about it. You really need to be an expert. I think learning how to write a review is a really good thing. I always encouraged my graduate students to write a review with me. If you could ask your supervisor if you want that to happen, but just remember that the supervisor who is asked to write the review has to ask the editor of the journal whether it's appropriate to, whether he or she has whether you have permission to bring that graduate student on. You can't do it without asking. You really have to respect the confidentiality throughout this whole thing. Yeah, we haven't talked about confidentiality and security and all of that stuff yet, and I see I'm running out of time. You can't use the information necessarily. You have to declare all your conflict of interest. You have to try not to be influenced by issues of the origins of nationality. And yeah, they're there. I have sent these slides on to Megan so you can get them if you want. I want to talk about other issues just quickly. Ethics, you can lose your whole paper if you don't include your IRB, ERB editor number. There's one German researcher by the name of Blunt. He lost a lot of papers because he didn't bother to get ethics approval. You also need to think about privacy and confidentiality of your study participants, especially if you have a small sample size, like a case report. There was a paper retracted because the case report was retracted because the authors couldn't find the person, and then the person came out of the woodwork and said, pull it out, I don't like it. You have to declare your funding source. You have to declare your conflicts of interest. You need to be upfront and transparent in describing them and how you got around them. So be careful on funding sources and conflicts of interest. Far better to declare them up front and talk about issues. Legitimate mistakes, boy, I fall into this category. Mistakes happen. And it's going to, if you publish more than 2 papers, I think you're going to find you make mistakes. So you need to own up to them. Own up to them early. You own up to your fellow authors, the journal editors, and you address the mistake appropriately. And usually your papers don't get pulled if you legitimately address your mistakes as you see them. Contribution section, this is becoming more common. Yeah, who did what and how much with regard to the paper. And I think these are really important, and make sure that you describe the roles of each author and their contributions. And the authors of all the authors of your paper must agree to this section. And there have actually been problems when the corresponding author just kind of dashed these off. So yeah. Spend some time on your contribution section. This isn't really an issue of academic integrity. This is an issue of just being a good person. The acknowledgement section, this is for the place where you mention people who've done work but have not been done enough or the quality of work to become an author. So this is really important to undergrad students or maybe a librarian who's done an excellent job on searching. Yeah, but don't go overboard. I've seen people who thank the typist in the acknowledgement section. Other issues, retracted papers. It's sometimes hard to find out if a paper's retracted. And just think about what would happen if you do a meta-analysis that uses a retracted paper, one that's complete fabrication. What happens if it's a duplicate paper and you put the data in twice? What if it's an inaccurate paper? And the fix on that one is to ask someone, it might be a librarian, to check for retractions, because it's hard to find retractions. Much easier to find the original papers. Okay, I want to talk about predatory journals. Watch out for them. A predatory journal is where there's a business interest that has said, oh, we really like the fact that people will pay to get their journal published, their journal article published. So why don't we take their money and we'll publish it as it is, and we can keep all the money. We won't necessarily put it into doing high quality peer review and making it look nice. So, and you're going to be getting lots of these calls. You probably get them already. Here's Beal's list of potential, possible, or probable predatory scholarly open access publishers. This is a huge list. I just chopped out some around Canada. So do not publish, or be careful if you publish in the Canadian Academy of Oriental and Occidental Culture, Canadian Centre for Science and Education, Canadian Research and Development Centre of Sciences and Cultures, Canadian Research Publication, Canadian Science and Research Group, Canadian Science and Technology Press. So those are predatory journals. This list is actually from a fellow by the name of Beal at the University of Colorado, and he has actually had to take this list down. This list that I gave you the link to of the predatory journals is actually a mirror site. The original site was taken down because the university is being sued, and Beal has been threatened with his job if the list doesn't come down. But with mirror sites, we've got it there. So you need to be careful on predatory publishers, especially around your thesis and dissertation. Just about as soon as you graduate, you'll be getting calls to say, gee, this is a wonderful thesis. I'm going to turn it into a book. Give me your copyright. Be careful there. Certainly with publications, you're going to be getting emails saying, do you want to be an editor? Do you want to be an author? Do you want to be a reviewer? And for some of these journals, you can actually buy an authorship spot. For $300, you too can be an author. And it's very easy to be fooled. Predatory journals are getting bigger. There were 400,000 of these predatory journal papers published in 2014. And be careful. The ramifications of bad publishing, you can lose your reputation an awful lot more. This researcher can no longer apply to any Canadian funding agency because of fraud, and they're now releasing names. So I'm done. This is the retraction board leaderboard. Do not ever be on this list. This is a list where you don't want to be on. And you can see that there's one fellow at the top. He's had 183 papers retracted. Joachim Bolt, he's had 96. He lost his papers because he didn't bother to do ethics. So on that cheery note, I think I'm going to end and see if you've got any comments or questions.
Please. here. I'm just waiting to see if anyone chats in any questions, but thank you. That was really interesting. And I did want to let you know that I did send the group your bio in advance of the presentation, so they did know who was presenting
Oh,
to them.
right. Oh, gosh, I forgot to do that. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Feel free to do it now if you want to. We have a few minutes.
No, I'm just retired, but I worked with Brian Haynes and Sharon Strauss, and my PhD is in medical informatics, which I got at a very late age.
All right. Well, I don't see anything coming in from our remote group, so I think we're all set. Do you have any closing remarks?
I just, think publishing is really serious business, and it has an incredible number of rewards, many, many rewards. There's just some minefields, and if they're really smart about it and have good mentors, which I'm sure they do, they should be able to steer clear of some of the excesses that we've seen this morning.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ann, for presenting to us this morning, and I hope the rest of your day goes well.
Thank you, Megan. Take care, everybody. Oh, email me if you have any questions or comments. My email's on the first slide.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.